Welcome to the Devin Nunes Podcast, breaking through the political noise, separating fact from fiction. From the San Joaquin Valley, the breadbasket of the solar system. Here is your host, Devin Nunes.
Welcome back to the Devin Nunes Podcast. It is great to have with us today Thaddeus McCotter, retired from the United States Congress. I served with him back in the 2000s. And we actually we came in together in 2002, class of 2002. And Thad is also a musician, a lawyer, and he lives in Michigan. So this week we're going to talk about, first segment, we're going to talk about Michigan, but I have a little surprise for all of you that we're going to get to in just a moment. And then we're going to talk about a piece on Friday that Thad wrote for American Greatness, which we've talked a lot about stories that have come on American Greatness with Victor Davis Hanson, Chris Buskirk, and others. But Thad, let me welcome you to the show. I love your backdrop with the guitars. Thanks for coming on this week.
Oh, thanks for having me. Nice to see you again. I know you've been rather busy saving the Republic.
Well, look, Thad and I both go on the John Batchelor show together. We used to do that many years ago, when before there were podcasts. Thad, I think if I recall, I had a segment on Wednesday nights, which you had to do live. I think I came on at 9, and you came on at 9:30. So we go back a long ways together, reaching out to the airwaves, trying to reach our constituents, trying to reach voters, trying to reach people all over the country. And so I want to thank you for doing this. But before we get started, the number one question that I get asked, bar none, is where on earth did you get that song from? I can't find that song anywhere. I love the song. Some people say, why do you play the same song every time? And I will answer that question first. The reason I have to is because Thad wrote the song and he gave me permission to play the song every time. If I just stole stuff from the Rolling Stones or the Beatles or someone like that, it would take a nanosecond before I'd get attacked, and I'm sure they'd try to shut my podcast down, because you can't just take content from creators and start playing it. But the author of the song is none other than Thaddeus McCotter. So Thad, walk our listeners through. They get to listen to the song all the time. When did you write the song? Why did you write the song?
Well, really, it's exactly what you said. Back when I was in Congress, I wrote it precisely for the reasons you laid out, because if you borrow somebody else's song, the fair use doctrine is not necessarily evenly applied to conservatives. So if you had taken, like you said, a Rolling Stones song or a Beatles song or somebody, you'd get a letter in the mail from their solicitor telling you to cease and desist. So I figured I'd write it, because I've written songs in the past when I was younger especially, and you still dabble at it even at my advanced age. So sat down and wrote it, and I said, well, one day I'll put it on tape and maybe I'll use it for something. And I was out in your neck of the woods, out in California. I think it was during a time I actually spoke in your district at one of your events. And so I had some friends from an organization that doesn't exist anymore, and they were very musically inclined, Gary and Shelley Eaton. And we went to his place, and he had the tape machine and the recording and stuff. And so he's singing on it with his wife, Shelley. I'm playing guitar, he's playing guitar. My brother Dennis was around, so he played on it. And we put it down on tape, and I was like, well, what am I going to do with it now? And I thought about using it for a campaign song, but then at the time, our mutual friend Andrew Breitbart had passed away. And so at the time, we put it up on one of the online places where you could buy music. And we took the proceeds and gave them to the Breitbart children, Breitbart's family, for him. So it actually eventually wound up, you liked it, and you asked if you could use it. I said, sure. You're not paying any royalties on it, so I figured as cheap as you are, it would be a perfect fit.
Well, look, this is not a for-profit podcast, as you know. I just try to get this so I can go above and on the sides and below the mainstream media and the social media companies to try to get information directly to folks. So I want to thank you for that song. And some people claim, well, the song, it plays at the end for a long period of time. But I always tell people, look, that's good, because it's like an intermission. So as you're listening to my podcast, you get like a 4-minute intermission to go get some popcorn, bring back in a cold beer, or if you're driving, stop and get a soda.
If it's playing at the end, and you don't like it, you can shut it off, man.
You can shut it off. That's right.
And come back.
So how did you get into, so you played music, right, as a teenager, and you actually did, you and your brother had a band at one time, right?
Yeah. Flying Squirrels. We were various names. We had like the Knights of the Terrestrial Jam. things like that. We just had fun with it. You know, we played a lot of dive bars, and we were a garage band and dive bars. It was great. It was Detroit, man, back in the 80s.
Yeah. I should have said that. You're right outside of Detroit.
Yeah.
You were a county supervisor before you became you were a state senator in Michigan,
Yeah.
and you became a
trustee, community
US
college trustee, just like you were. Yep, a lot in common. And it was fun. It was fun. I did it, and I'd play every now and again. And we had the band in Congress, the Second Amendments with Kenny Hulshoff, John Porter, another one of our classmates, and Colin Peterson. It was bipartisan. We'd play around. We'd play events, and it was nice. It was a nice thing to do. As a Republican, most people don't think that you have any artistic sensibility whatsoever because they consider us Philistines in the mainstream collusion media. It was nice to dispel that myth every now and again.
Well, you are a talented guy, Thad. You served in our leadership. You're also a very good writer. You're now writing for American Greatness. And I want to talk about that piece that you wrote. It was very, very well written. We'll talk about that on Friday. But let me, people want to know what's going on in Michigan. I went out to Michigan before this pandemic hit, did some speaking events for some of our members of Congress that are out there. I've been requested to go back there before the election. I don't know if I'll make it or not. But matter of fact, you and I had lunch when I was out there. And so it was obvious even back then, you saw zero signs or flags or anything for a Democrat. But yet when you drove through those districts, I mean, every quarter mile, there was a big Trump sign, a big Trump flag. So there's clearly this, as it is across the country, rural and small town America is Trump country, and I think growing. And then the question is what's going to happen in these big cities? And you have a great candidate that's at the top of the ticket, John James, who's running for the United States Senate, war veteran, African American, very, very articulate guy. And then, of course, all of this activity that's going on in Michigan, and just like last time, they claim, oh, no chance, no chance, no chance. Well, lo and behold, Trump won Michigan. So what are you finding? What are you seeing on the ground out there that you can share with our audience here?
Well, clearly, since the Democratic convention, the Democratic intensity's picked up a bit. It's ticked up. We're seeing signs on lawns that we had not seen this early in an election cycle before Labor Day. The amount of them, places where you wouldn't expect them. But the Trump signs, the intensity of the Trump signs is amazing. It's off the charts, especially this early in an election. I've never seen it for a Republican candidate at any level. Now, whether that translates into a majority of the vote, we don't know, but I can guarantee you that anybody who supports President Trump will be making it to the polls. And I think a large part of that, some of it comes, especially from our governor, who's been ruling with dictatorial emergency powers and a never-ending quest to stop to bend the curve. It's already been bent in April, but she doesn't seem to want to let go of the emergency powers. She's been acting in defiance of the legislature, just basically using the claim that somehow she's keeping us safe. She's becoming a one-person governmental entity, which is unfortunate. And so I think that's driving a lot of the Trump support here in Michigan, and you'll see that in other lockdown states. You've seen some of that in California with the way Newsom's behaving out there and some of your local elected officials. So in Michigan, I have no doubt that the Trump vote will turn out. The question is whether or not it's going to amount to a majority of the vote in Michigan. I think it will, but it's going to be razor thin. I think the Democrats know this, which is why they're pushing bogus polls to try to depress Trump's vote, which will not happen. They're voting them. They're going to crawl across glass to vote for President Trump. And then when you look at it, the mail-in voting, things like that, they've been trying to do certain things. I don't think it's going to work in Michigan. They're not going to be able to get away with it. We've had a very strong absentee program in Michigan. It's served us very well. I think the public is very happy with it and will continue to use it. So I don't think the mail-in should be a problem. It will be larger than in the past. Mm-hmm. But I think the irregularities, we've had a problem with Detroit. A bipartisan election commissions have looked at it. They're very concerned about the counting procedures in Detroit. I know that that'll be watched, and in fairness, it'll be watched by both sides, because both sides have admitted that the primary was a huge problem in terms of tallying up the vote. So other than that, in other cities, I think Michigan, it's going to be a very, it's house to house, person to person. And it's going to be another razor thin margin, but I think the president will prevail again.
So as we look at the map, obviously the area that Trump will not win will be Detroit, the greater area of Detroit. And that is, what is that, Oakland County?
It's Wayne County, and
Wayne
Oakland County is the suburban part of it. Macomb County is heavily President Trump. It's basically the tri-county area, but then you toss in Washtenaw, which has the University of Michigan, which is Ann Arbor, very liberal. And then you look at Livingston County, which is where Mike Rogers, our old colleague, was from, and that's very conservative. So, but when you look at it, and we did this during the recount, you would see this during the recount as participated in that. Trump has changed so many governing paradigms. You and I used to talk about the cross currents of globalization, how traditional voting patterns break down, how traditional party lines break down on any given issue because of how it's affecting your constituents and how it affects different constituencies differently. When we went through the recount, you would see a heavy Trump vote out of blue-collar, traditionally Union Democratic areas, and then you would see Hillary Clinton votes out of what used to be moderate suburban Republican areas. And essentially, they had flipped each other. And I think that the problem we're seeing with polling and the problem with a lot of the projections and prognostications is no one is really understanding why that has occurred. And they're sticking with their traditional means of trying to measure and predict outcomes. When the reality is nobody understands quite what the new governing coalitions are in the process of becoming. And especially also, I don't know a lot of conservatives are going to tell a stranger on the phone who they're voting for. They're just not going to answer that phone. They're just going to hang up.
Well, and you've talked a lot about the challenges that we had with world trade, and you spent a lot of your time on that in Congress advocating for exactly that demographic that Trump ran on. That you were early to this because you grew up, in that, watching a lot of the factories close down, watching the ascension of China, while some of us on the West Coast were saying, well, hey, we're shipping a lot of products to China. This is helping us, and we think that the Chinese are ultimately maybe going to improve. Clearly, those of us who thought that were wrong, which was, that was 90% of Republicans and Democrats all said that exact same thing. But you were one of the few that said, look, Ronald Reagan won these parts here in the Rust Belt because, he had the union votes. He understood these jobs are important to America, that we had to build things and make things in America. We got away from that after Ronald Reagan, and we lost a lot of those jobs. You watched that growing up. You brought that back. You were one of the first people talking about that. I know if somebody goes back and reads, you wrote a book about it, and you also have a lot of speeches that you gave on the House floor. But that's really that coalition that you're talking about, that Trump has managed to break through that ice again and has brought those, kind of the workers back to the Republican Party, where now the Democrats are essentially the party of oligarchs and elitists and, leftists and rich people. You see it, I see it when I go there, Thad, whether it's Michigan, I'm going to be in Ohio shortly. I've been in Wisconsin. It's just in Pennsylvania. It's incredible what's happened there. And that's really that phenomenon you're seeing. So back to the 3-county area. Outside of there's really, Trump will win essentially the rest of the state, right? Other than a few pockets, probably, right?
Yeah, there'll be pockets, and we have some larger cities outstate. Grand Rapids will be a very difficult contest for him, and some of the outlying parts, suburban areas. But look, when you drive through Michigan, when you get outside, or look anywhere in Michigan, you're going to see Biden, you're going to see Trump. As you start to get outside of Southeast Michigan, which is down here, got the UP up here. I spent some time in the Upper Peninsula earlier this year with my wife, and there's nothing but Trump signs up there. There's a handful of Biden signs throughout the entire Upper Peninsula. Basically, what you're looking at, Devin, is to a certain extent, the way I've tried to explain this election to people is essentially you have people who believe America is a fundamentally good country, and you have people who believe America is a fundamentally bad country and want to fundamentally transform it. And which side of that line you're on, what is systemic racism? If you believe in systemic racism, which we'll talk about later, how can you not say America is an intrinsically evil country and needs to be fundamentally transformed? If you believe America is a good country that is always striving to improve to reach a more perfect union, then you're probably going to vote for Trump. That is basically the question right now. The attacks on President Trump are all to distract people from Trump's a horrible, horrible guy, which is an ad hominem attack to distract you from the policies the Democrats are putting forward, because their policies stink and they've failed throughout human history, and they've led to some of the most horrific types of government we've ever seen in human history. So at the end of the day, it's going to come down to that is really going to be the fundamental question. Do you think America is good and deserves to continue to improve, or do you think it's fundamentally flawed and has to be fundamentally transformed? That's kind of where we're at. It's the elites versus the salt of the earth, and that's really kind of where we're at.
So last question on salt of the earth. One of the greatest African American populations in the United States of America is in Detroit. Great music from there, great tradition. A lot of African Americans worked in the auto industry. Very famous musicians from there. We now have a Republican African American at the top of the ticket in Michigan, and as you know, since the 50s, essentially, where Republicans used to get 70 or 80 or 90% of the African American vote until essentially they came in and the Democrat socialists started using this identity politics, where now we lose 90% of the African American vote. President Trump has spent an enormous amount of time on this, and the key really is can the president get anywhere above that traditional 8 to 12% of African Americans that vote for Trump in Michigan? And I'd be interested. I mean, you live right next to that area. You've seen the president in there a lot. Do you think there is a shot that the president can up that percentage in this election? And where would we look to see that in Michigan?
Well, since the 90s, the African-American middle class has left Detroit. It's in the suburbs with everybody else. And we've had very low incidence of any types of problems, which is one of the great stories about the Metro Detroit area that nobody ever talks about. All they ever talk about with Metro Detroit in our area is the bad stuff. Well, this was a positive development. It was a wonderful development. And so when you talk about voters, I don't look at voters as this or that. I just look at their interests. And you have a lot of middle-class voters across the spectrum that are very worried about the economy coming out of the pandemic. And they're very worried about the governmental lockdowns and other things that have stunted our economy and driven people into despair and into bankruptcy. And so when you're looking at that, jobs are going to be increasingly the number one issue for people in the suburbs. And all of Biden's talk about the economy when he was vice president, I don't want to go back to that economy. I want to go back to the booming economy that we had 2 years ago, 3 years ago, until the pandemic hit. And the president can rebuild that. In fact, your congressional majority of Republicans helped build that too with the tax relief. And we need to send you guys back to a majority so you can help him rebuild this country and bring us back and better than we have been in the past, the great American comeback from the pandemic. So I think that everybody's looking at this now with John James. He's a tremendous candidate. And I would hope, especially for people in the suburbs, to say, if not now, when? When is Michigan going to elect its first African-American senator? Mm-hmm. I mean, John James is everything you'd want in a U.S. senator and more. And Gary Peters, who I know, I don't dislike Gary, but Gary's just not as an accomplished individual as John James. Gary's much more of a career politician. And so if you send John James to the U.S. Senate, Michigan will be better served. And so the question to the suburbanites is, if not now, when? Right?
Well, Thad, that is a great rundown of Michigan. Now all of our listeners know where the song that's going to play right now, the song's going to start playing as we're finishing right here. We're going to come back to Thad on Friday to talk about this great piece that he wrote for American Greatness. Thad, thanks for being on, and we'll catch you on Friday. Thank you. It's Devin Nunes.
Thanks for listening to the Devin Nunes Podcast. We invite you to subscribe so you don't miss a single episode. And remember, you can download this podcast on iTunes or at devinnunes.com.
Storm clouds been gathering so long, I don't know.
The darkness around us leaves no easy road.
We've started wondering if every road dead ends our dreams. Wind whips the dust up and rain's pouring down.
Good people struggling in every hometown.
We've started wondering if we even matter at all. We'll take that hard road to happier days, 'cause we kept our American faith. Now it's not our first trial by fire like this.
It's nothing hard working family can't fix.
We've got the power to save it all here in our hands. We'll take that hard road to happier days. 'Cause we kept our American faith. As we, the people, free and strong, fight through the dark night toward the dawn. Freedom marches on. Now the hard road is waiting, but we're not afraid.
That's why they call her the home of the brave.
With a prayer and a purpose, we're already half the way there. We'll take that hard road to happier days. 'Cause we kept our American faith. Ooh, we kept our American. We kept our American. Ooh, we kept our American. We kept our American faith. Freedom marches on.
Paid for by Devin Nunes Campaign Committee.